Mr. President, representatives from government, although missing the representative from the Central Drug Authority, the representatives from SANEC, from civil society, community leadership, I welcome you to the 2023 Africa Policy Week. Africa Policy Week has evolved out of the South African Drug Policy Week, which started in 2016 when we had some money from open society foundations and weren't sure what to do with it. And so we very quickly put together the first South African Drug Policy Week ahead of the United Nations General Assembly Special Session on Drugs. Professor Julian Buchanan was the keynote speaker at that event, somebody who President Motlanthe referenced extensively in his talk at the Harm Reduction International Conference in Melbourne. At that very first Drug Policy Week, we had a discussion in a side room about the first opioid substitution program in South Africa. We felt quite motivated to start this, and Professor Monique Marks, Professor Yanni Hugo, Dr. Scheiber, and a few others had a conversation, and shortly thereafter, we started the very first program, low threshold program in Durban, South Africa. At the 2027 Drug Policy Week, we had representatives from the Global Commission on Drug Policy. We had a commissioner, we've had several commissioners here. We've had the commissioner from Switzerland, Helen Dreyfus, the former president of Switzerland. We had Helen Clark, the former president of New Zealand, Prime Minister of New Zealand, I apologize. We've had Michelle Kazakhstan. We've had Anant Grover. And we are very grateful to the Commission for the support they've given us over the years. And our own president, former President Motlanthe, is a member of the Commission and now has started the East and chairs the East and Southern African Commission on Drug Policy, which is a remarkable achievement considering in 2016 there was very little support for any of this type of conversation. After 2017, we had the 2018 event, which we were very fortunate to again have representatives from the Global Commission and a lot of international speakers. We were interrupted by COVID, and so we had the Drug Policy Day, the African Drug Policy Day, where Justice Cameron was kind enough to give us his input. The reason for going through this history is to say that this particular event has got a history. It is known for sparking change. But we felt that this year there needed to be something different, something more local, something more African, because it's all good and well to hear about best practice examples from overseas, but we have a particular context which a lot of people don't understand. They have not lived through it. And we need to address that. We need to find solutions which are suitable to our context, to our people, which are driven by motivation from the community rather than imposed. There's the saying, that you do for me without me, you do to me. And we best remember that. So I'm immensely grateful to have the former president here today. This process started many years ago in Lisbon, where we had our first discussions around the possibility of the Commission establishing itself. At 2018 Drug Policy Week, we discussed that further with Michelle Kazakhstan. And now, despite COVID, here we are. Whatever happens over the next few days, know this: you are part of an event that changes lives through changing policy. It's proven it in the past, and we will prove it again. It's these small meetings of people who are heavily invested in the particular issue that spark the conversations, that spark the interest and the curiosity that drives change. Be part of the conversation, and we need to put people before policy. So welcome to the Policy Week. I hope that it becomes as beneficial to you as it has to me over the years. In brief thanks, I'd like to thank, of course, the amazing Julie, who has worked with me for over a decade, and without whom none of this would have happened. I thank the organizations that I work with, the University of Pretoria and TB HIV Care, for their constant support, and Sandput, an organization I was privileged enough to be a founding member of, and which I chair, for the support that they've given me over the years, and the support they've given to people who use drugs in South Africa and the policy change. Just before we get to the keynote address, I would like to ask on some of our partners to say one or two brief words. Unfortunately, The CDA, Nandi is not here, but I'm going to reach out to SANEC. Now, if we could, maybe the partners could come and just sit in front here so you can go quickly one after the other. SANEC, we've got Sisonke Sanput, a joint statement, the UNODC, and NACOSA. If you could just sit here and then come up in that order just to briefly say your few words of introduction. Yeah, one by one. Thank you. Swebuka, would you like to go first? We all know SANEC, the South African National AIDS Council, and thank you for being here with us.
Program Director, I would like to observe the established protocol with a special acknowledgement to His Excellency, former President Kgalema Motlanthe, who was also chairperson of SANEC between the year 2009 and 2014. Let me also acknowledge my fellow panelists and all the stakeholders represented here today. Esteemed delegates, media friends, colleagues, good evening to you all. My name is Zwebuka Khumalo from the South African National AIDS Council, SANEC in short. I'm an executive manager for the Strategic Information Unit. I'm representing the SANEC CEO, Dr. Thembisile Xulu, who's currently abroad on other commitments. She sends her regards and asks that I accept SANEC commitment to this work. Esteemed delegates, SANEC recently launched the National Strategic Plan for HIV, TB, and STIs for the period 2023 to 2028. This is a roadmap that enables organizations and individuals to pull together to respond to the three epidemics of HIV, TB, and STI in South Africa by putting people at the center of each goal and adopting high-impact interventions to address social and structural determinants of HIV, TB, and STIs. It recognizes key population, which include people who are using drugs, sex workers, transgender people, men who have sex with men, and inmates, including other priority populations. It also proposes a range of interventions that should be explored in response to specific challenges faced by each vulnerable group. The new National Strategic Plan prioritizes addressing the drug epidemic as captured in all four goals of this plan. Goal 1 of this plan highlights the importance of addressing social and structural drivers. Goal 2 focuses on prevention and treatment interventions, which are aligned to evidence-based mechanisms, including provision of harm reduction services. The third goal of this plan makes reference to the importance of system strengthening. And the last goal, which is goal 4, focuses on governance and leadership. In South Africa, drug use is a recognized rising epidemic. The geographical location, well-developed infrastructure, and accessible ports make South Africa attractive as a transit location and a major drug traffic route. With the availability of drugs in our shores comes the increase in demand and use of drugs. Risk factors such as poverty, unemployment, trauma, including gender-based violence, are also factors that contribute to drug use. And what was once termed an urban problem has expanded into rural communities. The new National Strategic Plan prioritizes the implementation of evidence-based harm reduction services, including the provision of opioid substitute therapy. and needle and syringe programs. The new National Strategic Plan further advocates for the decriminalization of drug possession for personal use. Currently, some government departments lag in facilitating and enabling supportive legislation and policies that could improve access to these interventions beyond private and NGO sector. SANEC calls for an agent prioritization by government departments to prioritize the implementation of evidence-based, high-impact interventions grounded on human rights principles. It envisions a country with medical assisted therapy clinics integrated within the public health systems, justice and correctional services. Government departments need to strengthen interdepartmental coordination to ensure that the directorate speaks to each other. SANEC supports out-of-country learning, sharing, and tools and best practices to strengthen and adapt the provision of these services. South Africa identifies a need for supportive legal framework with the development of key policies on harm reduction, peer navigation, and updating standard treatment guidelines to include the provision of methadone. The National Drug Master Plan further provides a roadmap and lists priorities to be implemented to achieve a multi-sectoral response and outcomes against each of the plan's 7 goals. Its implementation is coordinated by the Central Drug Authority with the support of SANEC. The CDA has also developed Drug Action Plan with the involvement of traditional leaders with 6 objectives to improve coordination. In addition, the Health Sector Drug Master Plan and the National Strategic Plan for HIV, TB, and STI have equally contributed to the opportunity to continue to work together and have visibility of the activities that also require the support of SANEC. The Africa Drug Policy Week comes at an opportune time as it brings together people from the Southern, East, and West Africa to influence and develop policy and ensure the protection of human rights, the prevention of life, and the creation of safer and caring communities. Thank you, and we're looking forward to a very productive week.
Go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. Lovely to see you all here, looking gorgeous. Yes, so my name is Zinhle Cholwana, and I am from Sisonke National Sex Workers Movement in South Africa. So I'd like to greet you all and all protocols observed. A special thank you to our keynote speaker today, President Kgalema Motlanthe. I think your presence in this policy, in this summit is such a monumental and a historic event. So thank you very much, President, for joining us. I think for this summit, I think it's a very, very important summit, and the theme for this year, putting people first, I think it's a very, very important theme that we need to take with us in the work that we do, especially working with key populations. In the past, we have seen that a lot of strategies or policies regarding to the health response, specifically with key populations, has always been a top-down kind of strategy, where you have people at the top, the researchers and big policymakers dictating how to successfully address the health response with regards to key populations. But we have seen that over the years and over the decades, that doesn't seem to work, because the strategies and policies that are developed do not speak to the needs of the key populations. It doesn't speak to the communities that the policies seek to help. And so now if we look at it from a bottom-up approach, so where you have the communities themselves that are leading in terms of what solutions do we need for us as the communities, then I think we can definitely see that there can be a huge positive change. If we look at community-led monitoring, for example, that's been a really successful model where you have the communities themselves that go to their health facilities, and they're the ones that monitor those facilities if they are functioning well. So you can see with models like that, where if we put the communities first, if we have the communities leading in this fight for against HIV/AIDS and HIV, TB, and STIs, then I think that we can really see a more sustainable kind of solution. Because I come from Sisonke, the biggest national sex workers movement, I do just want to speak briefly on the importance of law reform in the health response. The two are interlinked. We cannot put them, separately. And so if we want to develop successful policies, especially with criminalized communities, such as sex workers and people who use drugs, you can't achieve any of that sustainably and successfully if we don't have decriminalization. Now, currently, we are sitting with a bill that is in Parliament for decriminalizing sex work. And in developing that bill, the community, sex workers themselves, were consulted in the development of this bill. Now, this is a very important part, because then we see that sex workers were leading in the development of this bill. The Department of Justice held consultations and asked them, what is it that you want for decriminalization? What does decriminalization look like for you? And so through these consultations, the bill was developed, and the bill really has three asks. It's to decriminalize buying, selling, brothel keeping in sex work, and also to remove the criminal, anybody who has criminal records related to this act. But now we seem to be hitting a bit of a snag. I will get more into it during the panel discussion. But I do just want to emphasize that we have to, this is not just a theme, we have to live this. When we go back to our communities, we have to remember to put people first and to ensure that the communities themselves, our key populations, are empowered to lead in positively changing their lives through policies in the country. I think I'll end it there. Thank you very much.
Good evening, distinguished delegates. My name is Gunashekaran Rangaswamy, and I am from UNODC, based in Pretoria. I'm very happy to be here today. Let me acknowledge His Excellency, Honorable Former President, colleagues from Sandport, SANAC, NACOSA, colleagues from the African Union, Local Drug Action Committee representatives, and a lot of civil society representatives here, and my former colleagues. Once again, good evening, all protocols observed. I'm happy to be here on this important drug policy week and the opening plenary. This appreciates the critical role of various stakeholders who have gathered here and is going to be here for most of this week's deliberations. On behalf of UNODC, first of all, let me congratulate the organizers for bringing us all together. And this is an opportune time for us to really discuss when so much is happening around us. I take this opportunity to appreciate you for your efforts in addressing challenges of drugs at the community level through your leadership in fighting for a rights-based, gender-sensitive policies and evidence-informed programming on the ground. I would like to acknowledge and appreciate the efforts of Central Drug Authority of South Africa, National Department of Health, Department of Social Development, Department of Correctional Services, SANAC, and collaboration by many other stakeholders who are present here today. To come to some of the points that I wanted to share, according to the World Drug Report 2023, globally over 296 million people used drugs in 2021, an increase of 23% over the previous decade. The number of people who suffer from drug use disorders, meanwhile, has skyrocketed to 39.5 million, a 45% increase over 10 years. The year 2023 marks the midpoint of the work towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. The global drug phenomenon continues to challenge both the implementation of SDG targets and efforts to promote peace, security, and human rights. The industry of illicit drugs continues to ramp up production during these challenging times. Seizures of synthetic drugs have multiplied in the last 10 years, and non-medical use of tramadol continues to endanger people in Africa and the Middle East. In Africa, a number of drug users is projected to rise by around 40% in the next decade, simply because of demographic changes. Although a rise in people who use drugs is predicted worldwide, it is likely to be particularly pronounced in Africa because the population is younger and drug use is higher among young people than among older people. Young populations are most vulnerable to be using drugs and are more severely affected by substance use disorder in several regions. In Africa, 70% of the people in drug use treatment are under the age of 35. This is really something that we need to be mindful of. Therefore, there is a need for a collective continental response. The UNODC Strategic Vision for Africa 2030 can support in this continental response with an integrated, people-centered, human rights-based approach, empowering African societies as they develop sustainable solutions to drug-related challenges. Even as we work in the long-term sustainable solutions, there are people who need access to treatment now. There is evidence showing the health vulnerability of people who use drugs with drug use disorders, including those living with infectious diseases and those in prisons. Therefore, it is imperative that we prioritize these groups of people. When it comes to HIV, 41% of the new infections in East and Southern Africa occur in South Africa, while another 34% in 4 countries, Kenya, Uganda, Zambia, and Tanzania. Progress since 2010 in controlling new HIV infections among adults in East and Southern African countries is insufficient to reach the 2025 target. Sex workers, people who inject drugs, men who have sex with men, their partners contribute to 32% new HIV infections in East and Southern Africa, with high prevalence reported in most countries, with poor intervention coverage. This is something that we need to be noted, and with lack of data reported by most of these countries. The data that we have may not be the real figures, that might be even more. So East and Southern Africa region did not reach the political declaration target for new HIV infections among adults in 2021. Reaching the 2025 targets needs massive effort to scale up what works. Harm reduction works. Let us put our best efforts forward to make this a reality. We need to reach those who are most difficult to reach, because they need us the most, like people who use drugs, especially in rural marginalized communities and people in prisons. We need to be able to work more with them because they also face barriers of stigma and discrimination. Women are most affected and they often face greater barriers to treatment for drug use disorders. We need to ensure access to care for all and focus on the specific treatment needs of women. We also need to ensure that controlled medicines are available for pain relief in Africa. At the UNODC, we are committed to continuing close cooperation with member states in providing care and support to people affected by illicit drugs, no matter the circumstances. Honorable President, distinguished guests, two core principles of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development are to ensure that we leave no one behind and to reach the farthest who are left, who are put very much behind. So people who use drugs are some of the first to be left behind in almost all circumstances. Everyone has a role to play. We all have a role to play, from governments, civil society, to individuals, traditional leadership, in bringing the necessary attention and resources to this issue. And UNODC stands ready to work with everyone. UNODC reiterates the call to ensure the provision of evidence-based prevention and treatment services and recognizes the value of civil society in this regard. I'm confident that the Africa Policy Week organized here will help us to harmonize our actions and remind ourselves again to achieve a more humane, evidence-informed drug policy for South Africa. In this regard, I call on the various representatives to improve data collection in order to facilitate the design and provision of appropriate HIV, drug use prevention, substance use disorder, and rehabilitation services. Comprehensive data on drug use patterns and trends is key to developing effective treatment and rehabilitation programs. Scaling up of programs for people who use drugs and people in prisons are critical. I would like to conclude by affirming that UNODC's support to join the government of South Africa and the civil society. Let us show those who need us that we care by providing evidence-based services to promote people's health in South Africa. Let me wish everyone a successful meeting and deliberations this week for a better health for all of us. Thank you very, very much.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. May I start by apologizing for being a bit late. A flight that was supposed to be at 2:30 left a few minutes before 3 o'clock this afternoon. Sincere apologies for that. My name is Nandi Mayatula Koza. I'm from the Central Drug Authority, Honorable former President and Chairperson of the East and Southern Africa Commission on Drug Policy, Honorable Khalima Mutlante, Honorable Minister with us, TB HIV Care, Sanput, the organizers of this policy week, as well as your partners and funders, and I'm not going to mention them by name in the interest of time, government departments who are represented today, other civil society organizations, South Africa's provincial and local drug action committees, community members and key populations, members of the media, distinguished guests. May I, on behalf of the CDA, congratulate the organizers and your partners for this well-organized Africa Policy Week 2023 with an inspiring theme, Putting People First, which builds on the statement issued by the UNHRC, calling on all countries to end stigma and discrimination and put people first. Let me just start by quoting the late Mr. Kofi Annan, who once said, and I quote, "Drugs have destroyed many lives, but wrong government policies have destroyed many more." And I hope the situation is changing. It is therefore imperative for the country's policies to be developed with empathy, understanding, and a genuine commitment to the people they serve in order to eradicate stigma and discrimination. Addressing substance use situations also demands a united, a coordinated, and a comprehensive effort by government departments, civil society organizations, people who use and inject drugs, healthcare professionals, and communities to stand together to the challenge the prevailing stigma, discrimination, criminalization, poverty, and inequalities. Criminalizing people who use drugs increase stigma and marginalization, acting as a barrier to education, employment, health, harm reduction, and psychosocial services. Our mandate as a Central Drug Authority is to oversee, coordinate, and monitor the implementation of the National Drug Master Plan. As I entered, the speaker was making reference to this blueprint that provides strategic direction to the country's efforts to deal with the use and misuse of substances. It sets out national drug policies and priorities to manage substance use disorders. I'm not going to talk about its vision, its goals, and mission in the interest of time, but we are mandated to advise government as a CDA on policies and programs in the field of substance use and drug trafficking. As such, we are most of the time consulted by government departments who develop public drug policies with the aim to amend legislation that does not assist in eradicating stigma and discrimination, and that is not people-centric. In collaboration with the multi-sectoral stakeholders, we therefore ensure that drug policies, strategies, and programs that are developed and implemented are scientific and evidence-based, human rights-based, people-centered, inclusive, participatory, multi-sectoral, and multilateral in line with the National Drug Master Plan principles and our country's constitution. In essence, policymakers are advised to align all the public drug policies to the National Drug Master Plan and the country's constitution, as well as to the 2030 SDGs, and to move away from the punitive approaches which have not been successful in tackling drug use-related challenges. This is to ensure safety and well-being of the target groups, which would include the vulnerable young people, children, women, including pregnant women, people with disabilities, occupational groups at risk, and key populations, including the LGBTIQ, sex workers, migrant workers, people who use and inject drugs, including people who are incarcerated in prisons for possession of small amounts of drugs. In the interest of time, I wanted to share with you some of the positive steps that are being taken by government of South Africa, but I've been asked to be short so that I allow our important guest to speak. But there's quite a number of those, and just for example, government is developing a policy on the prevention of and treatment of substance use disorders with the aim to amend the 2008 Act to adhere to the above-mentioned principles and the people-centric approach. And correctional services are taking steps to promote a policy on alternatives to punishment and incarceration for minor and first-time drug offending, and for young women, especially pregnant women and mothers engaged in illicit drug trade because of their situation of vulnerability and poverty. We are also working together with partners and stakeholders addressing the issue of incidences of HIV, hepatitis, TB, and STDs amongst people who use drugs. So I'm not going to elaborate, safe to say that government has committed itself, but the process is very slow. As a CDA, we are nudging those departments that are responsible for, for harm reduction programs, including the OST, needle and syringe programs, but the whole comprehensive program to reduce harm amongst people who take drugs. And I'm going to leave it there as CDA in the interest of time again. We thank you very much. We thank the organizers for this opportunity to say a few words to open as an opening statement, and we wish you all the best. Thank you.
Honorable President, esteemed guests, and delegates to the conference, it's really an honor and a pleasure to be able to be with you today. My name is Mohammed Motala, and I'm the Executive Director of an organization called NACOSA. NACOSA stands for the Network Community of HIV and AIDS in Southern Africa. It started its work before the democratic government came into this country. And over the years, increasingly, as it worked with in the world of HIV, recognized that there were key populations that were affected more than other populations by HIV. And one of them are people who use drugs. And in that sense, NACOSA runs programs that supports harm reduction and works closely with people who use drugs in that way. Part of our DNA, and what's exciting about this conference, is that it's titled Putting People First. And the second thing is that it's a policy conference. Having worked in civil society organizations through the transition in South Africa, you would know that the level at which community-based organizations and policy making and the role that NGOs had in doing that, we sort of got less and less over the years. In the earlier years, every NGO, social movements would have policy and research officers, and in that way contribute to policy making. As our new government came into place, a lot of that responsibility we gave over to government. And government, in the way that it went about delivering services, developing policy, and the sterling work that has been done changed many, many people's lives. But the role of civil society in that process slowly withdrew from policy making. And I think this conference and the opportunities it presents, in the way that Sean outlined how it came to be, really warmed my heart. That civil society, again, starting to engage actively with policy making and where that is going. So in that sense, we're really honored, and it's a pleasure to be able to be not only part of this conference, but support the policy work that goes on in it. In light of the earlier statements that were made, that the populations, the key populations, sex workers that Sisonke works in, that got spoken about. But tomorrow and in the days that come, I want to look at and hopefully build on the criminalization of key populations, but also the criminalization generally of poverty. Increasingly, you'll find that poor people who try to make a living on the streets, street traders, that is criminalized. In the city of Cape Town, for example, you won't find street trading. So people that work, poorer people that try to make a living, sex workers, street traders, this kind of work is criminalized. And perhaps there's something in the policy we need to look at, because you find that even people who use drugs, in the way that they lead their lives are criminalized. Looking at the populations, the prison populations, you'll find that poorer people and people that come from key populations, there's more chances of them coming into conflict with the law. So in the way that our policies are derived and the work that we do, perhaps there's something we need to look at. And that's what I'm interested in, that hopefully in the way that the week develops, the kind of policy making and the way that we're able to raise the voices of people. Because in NACOSA's work, putting people first is one of our key sort of priorities in the way that we deliver services, in the way that we make policy or we try to influence policy making. For us, the intersections between poverty, between racism, and people of color and how that impacts, and women, so weaker populations, marginalized populations, all of that comes together. And in the building of community-based organizations and in the supporting of movements that are at the heart of trying to bring about change, that is where we see our work as NACOSA. So being part of this conference is really something that I looked forward to, and it was a privilege and an honor to be asked to support the conference. Thank you very much.
I'm going to ask the panelists if they want to just take their seats in the front row here, so long. And as they move towards that, I would just like to thank very much SANAC and NACOSA, who stepped into the breach in the last moment to make sure that things went ahead. I'd also like to thank the efforts of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, which have been ongoing from the time that I first met Jason Eli right through to Gunnar's work, which has been tremendously supportive. Now it's time to do something which I never thought would be possible, which is to welcome a former president of South Africa onto the stage at a policy week. This really is amazing. Thank you. So, Your Excellency, Kgalema Motlanthe, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sean. Anything is possible. It always seems impossible until it is done. Madiba taught us. So even, when they write your obituary and they say RIP, you must know that it also means RIP doesn't only mean rest in peace. It also means resurrection is possible. Let me start off by acknowledging government representatives, representatives of regional and international organizations, members of civil society and NGOs, the panelists who were here, academics, distinguished participants, and dear delegates to this Africa Policy Week. Allow us to offer full respect and acknowledgement of the many organizations contributing to this event, as well as their staff and volunteers who dedicate themselves tirelessly to the countless people who suffer unnecessarily. May we also offer full respect and acknowledgement to the lives we have lost and to the survivors who contribute to the essential work that is carried out at these gatherings and who create systems of support to not only those in need, but also the development of scientific research and the trajectory towards positive and meaningful change for all people. It is an honor and privilege to be invited to participate at this 2023 Africa Policy Week with representatives from Southern, Eastern, and West Africa and around the world as we place a much needed focus on our beloved continent of Africa. As a member of the Global Commission on Drug Policy, I share the commitment of the 29 members working to inspire better drug policy globally, moving away from prohibition and advocating for policies based on scientific evidence, human rights, public health, and security to effectively leave no one behind. I arrived back in South Africa yesterday from Mauritius, where the second meeting of the Eastern and Southern Africa Commission on Drugs was held with fellow commissioners in collaboration with the government of Mauritius. What was discussed at this meeting has deep resonance with the issues to be discussed at this Africa Policy Week. The two-day gathering in Mauritius included experts from civil society, academia, multilateral agencies, as well as regional government officials with the purpose of focusing on current approaches to drug policy in our regions that do not seem to be working. At this meeting, we listened to the participants as they considered new ways of approaching drugs and drug policy, and certainly the action and appreciation of listening and being influenced. I think is an important first step. The act of listening is a very important first step so that we hear from those who are marginalized, from merely doing drugs. But please forgive me if I'm preaching to the choir. I know many of you in this room here today are experts in these matters, and this knowledge has been true for you for a long time. However, it is because of the knowledge and voices of people like you that my fellow commissioners and I are able to listen and learn from you. It is commendable that the theme for the 2023 Africa Policy Week is putting people first, building on the statement issued by the United Nations Human Rights Commission calling for an end to stigma and discrimination and to put people first. You've already heard that the late Kofi Annan, who together with President Olusegun Obasanjo established the West Africa Commission on Drugs, said, and I quote, that drugs have destroyed many lives, but wrong government policies have destroyed many more, close quote. And so when approaching the topics of drug policy in Africa, it must also be remembered that we should consider avoiding blanket approaches which by their nature rely on assumptions and fail to acknowledge why insight into particularity and uniqueness is a key to delivering a more equitable, inclusive, and sustainable outcome. We all know that out of all the countries that make up our continent, it is hard to find two that are exactly the same. However, in 2011, Martin Meredith stated that, and I quote, although Africa is a continent of great diversity, African states have much in common, not only their origins as colonial territories, but the similar hazards and difficulties they have faced. Indeed, what is so striking about the 50-year period since independence is the extent to which African states have suffered so many of the same misfortunes, close quote. Allow me to reiterate in part some of the points I made at the UN World Health Organization side event at the 29th Harm Reduction International Conference held earlier this year in Melbourne, Australia. The World Health Organization's 2011 publication entitled Ensuring Balance in National Policies on Controlled Substances, Guidance for Availability and Accessibility of Controlled Medicines is laid on the table to be discussed, deliberated upon, and dissected as the World Health Organization itself seeks to revise this guide for global and national policies. The 1961 UN Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs and the 1971 UN Convention on Psychotropic Substances, combined with the 1988 UN Convention Against Illicit Traffic in Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances, not only control international trade in the substances, but also impose requirements concerning the drug laws that countries must apply domestically, thus locking into place a rigid system of drug prohibition and control, including in Africa. As a consequence the international drug control system contains a deep-lying imbalance that favors punitive approaches over ensuring access to controlled medicines, despite the fact that the 1961 Single Convention has the key objective of ensuring access to and safe use of essential medicines, while limiting exclusively to medical and scientific purposes the production, manufacture, export, import, distribution of, trade in, use and possession of drugs, close quote. The impact of the 1961 Single Convention would become clear if we take a pain inventory of the world by stepping into the recent past and using the data available. The Lancet Commission on Palliative Care and Pain Relief, published in 2018, found that about 25.5 million out of 56.2 million people who died in 2015 experienced serious health-related suffering, and another 35.5 million experienced serious health-related suffering due to life-threatening and life-limiting conditions. A disproportionate number, more than 80% of these 61 million individuals, live in low-income and middle-income countries, of which Africa makes up a large proportion, with severely limited access to any palliative care, even oral morphine for pain relief. The report reads, and it continues, of the 298 million metric tons of morphine equivalent opioids distributed in the world each year, only 0.1 metric tons are distributed to low-income countries, and 50% of the global population, that is about 3.6 billion people who reside in the poorest countries, receive less than 1% of the morphine distributed worldwide, close quote. But as the pain inventory is attended to, filled out and ticked in wealthier countries, let us also recognize the other side of that coin of privilege and acknowledge the suffering of the opioid crisis in the United States of America, and how this unfortunate side of the coin has caused global alarm and perhaps in some countries, such as countries in our continent, added a layer of misinformation, anxiety, and excessively cautious knee-jerk reaction to morphine treatment. And in a region such as Sub-Saharan Africa, where many, many people who live in poverty die in agony as a result of AIDS-related conditions, of which a large portion are youth, a restrained and overcautious reaction to an opioid crisis across the Atlantic can result in the most poor and vulnerable, including children, not receiving palliative care due to misguided fear and lack of education and training on how to prescribe and administer morphine treatment. For instance, in South Africa, another factor that limits access to morphine is the fact that most nurses do not have the level of qualifications to prescribe it, in a country where many urban and rural clinics are without a resident medical doctor and are run by the nurses, and where nursing sisters are the skilled practitioners who take care of patients in hospices. Compounded on top of this complex situation, there is also the concern about the level of education and pain management that healthcare workers are receiving in South Africa. Therefore, a solution to this is education, education, education. And access to palliative care for people living in poverty. And it is this access to vital information that guides health practitioners to recognize causes of pain in order to treat and manage it. However, Program Director, if exposure to vital information is a major determinant to the access of palliative care for the poorest and most vulnerable people in the world, then the striking question that arises is, why did the World Health Organization withdraw and discontinue the 2011 guidance ensuring balance in national policies on controlled substances, guidance for availability and accessibility of controlled medicines, as well as the 2012 UN World Health Organization guidelines on the pharmacological treatment of persisting pain in children with medical illnesses? As if it was not enough to have existing layers of restricted access to the essential treatment, the World Health Organization's withdrawal of vital information seemingly exacerbated the problem by discontinuing the availability of guidelines that healthcare workers rely on to know what was safe and necessary for pain relief. Was the UN World Health Organization action taken to discontinue the 2011-2012 guidelines based on scientific evidence? I would like to assert that such actions have the potential to cause more harm to children in developing countries who may be left abandoned in their hour of agony to die in extreme pain. Professor Felicia Knoll of the University of Miami, chair of the Lancet Commission on Palliative Care, was quoted commenting, and I quote, "I believe that policies that work to deny access to necessary pain relief medication in low and middle income countries because of the situation in the United States of America are akin to denying food to people suffering from malnutrition because there is an obesity epidemic in the United States of America," close quote. So with the theme of this policy conference in mind, that is putting people first, another question arises that within the development of policy for Africa, we must ask how denying access to necessary pain relief in Africa because of the situation in the United States of America puts people first, and which people the UN intends to place at the head of the queue. The Eastern and Southern Africa Commission on Drugs believes that drug policies must be grounded in a public health approach based on scientific evidence and respect for human rights and always putting people first. drug prohibition has failed to achieve its goals of a drug-free world while having detrimental impact on our societies. It is causing far more harm than good. The past decade has seen impressive drug policy reforms at national and subnational levels around the world. More and more countries are adopting innovative approaches based on public health. Drug policies based on decriminalization and legalization are being pursued in a growing number of countries and being considered in many more. Our Commission seeks to promote the adoption of national legal frameworks and practices in line with human rights standards. This involves putting people's health and safety at the center, an approach that must overcome political barriers and be supported by adequate investment in evidence-based policy and practice. We believe also that governments of our region should consider a variety of reform in drug policy approaches, including decriminalization and legalization. Further, we feel that science can and should play a role not only in strengthening health and human rights approaches to drugs, but also in helping communities to achieve social justice. This means we must replace our existing harsh measures based on repressive ideologies with more humane and effective policies. These must be informed by scientific evidence, public health principles, and human rights standards. What we mean here is this. We must stop the practice of arresting people just because they use drugs, or might have a small amount of drugs on them for personal use. We must stop prosecuting and imprisoning people who use drugs. Alongside the war on drugs, the war on people who use drugs must also end. Since its inception in 2011, the Global Commission on Drug Policy advocates for 5 pathways of drug policy reform that fully fit in such an approach that places human rights at the center. These pathways are: 1, put people's health and safety first. 2, ensure access to essential medicines and pain control. 3, end the criminalization and incarceration of people who use drugs. 4, refocus enforcement responses to drug trafficking and organized crime. And 5, regulate drug markets to put governments in control. Considering that the right to health serves as the basis of our first 2 priorities, namely to put the health of people and communities first, and to ensure universal access to medicines under international control, the Global Commission stresses that governments need to establish clear plans and timelines to remove the domestic and international obstacles to the provision of essential medicines under international control. The Global Commission also recommends that to overcome the global crisis of avoidable pain, UN drug control bodies and states must recognize that drug policies at both national and international levels are imbalanced, with the current emphasis on preventing the diversion of controlled substances, which holds primacy over ensuring their access for medical use. We also believe that a high priority must be given to the treatment of physical and mental pain by ensuring access to controlled medicines, including opioids, for pain relief, palliative care, anesthesia, dependency, and all other forms of suffering, especially those that are on the World Health Organization's model list of essential medicines. It is equally important to expand the spectrum of treatment for opioid dependence while respecting human dignity and offering the possibility of prescription of controlled medicines such as methadone and buprenorphine or diamorphine. While the International Narcotics Control Board must take more assertive steps in working with countries that consistently lack adequate access to controlled medicines, ensuring they provide evidence-based estimates to document their needs, governments and UN drug control bodies should also review the 1961 and 1971 drug convention schedules in light of scientific evidence and prioritize exploring the medical benefits of controlled substances based on the World Health Organization's Expert Committee on Drug Dependence recommendations. With an increasing number of states and UN bodies drawing attention to the lack of access to controlled medicines, we are reaching a critical juncture. The Global Commission on Drug Policy encourages all stakeholders to join forces on tackling inequitable access to controlled medicines. And then, of course, we are aware on the 23rd of June this year, the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights released a statement calling for an end to the war on drugs, and part of that statement reads as follows: globally, drug control has had massive costs for the dignity, humanity, and freedom of people of African descent, with reports showing that people of African descent face disproportionate and unjust law enforcement interventions, arrests, and incarceration for drug-related offenses. In various countries, the war on drugs has been more effective as a system of racial control than as a tool to reduce drug markets. Policing interventions based on racial profiling remain widespread, whilst access to evidence-based treatment and harm reduction for people of African descent remains critically low, close quote. As members of the Eastern and Southern Africa Commission on Drugs, we believe that reshaping our little part of the world for human dignity goes hand in hand with better policies that use compassion and science as navigators through hardship, and that reduce and not produce harm in the process. As you gather here together this week, I wish that you will do so with the same energy and hope I've seen in the eyes of civil society activists from whom we have had the opportunity and privilege to learn so much. The work you are doing and the subjects that you are discussing are important. Important not just for their content, but for what they can do to shape policy in line with the theme and objectives of this gathering. In closing, I want to wish every one of you as participants in this Africa Policy Week, a productive and successful week ahead. And I thank you for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. That was indeed a call to action. Hello, everyone. My name is Colleen Daniels. I am the Deputy Director and Public Health Lead with an organization called Harm Reduction International. Though I'm based in the land of the colonizers in London, I actually am from Durban, so don't let the accent fool you either. So I just wanted to welcome all of you, our esteemed guests, our fabulous delegates, to this what's going to be an amazing week. It has already started off with such a bang. I am proud to be part of this incredible collective of people charging forward with big ideas to decolonize drug policy, to dismantle the colonial punitive systems that still govern our lives, to remove punitive approaches to health, which also still govern our lives, and to work together to shift power to the global majority. This is also a space where we can imagine and plan for a future where people who use drugs are treated with compassion and respect, where human rights are made real, and where oppression ends. I know that I stand between you and refreshments, so I'll be brief. Some of you had a very long day already. I just wanted to mention a few things. One of them is you'll see this sticker on the tables all over. This is a new Harm Reduction International campaign where we are calling for a divestment from the unjust war on drugs and investing in justice. So investing rather in people, in communities. We do have monies in our countries. We think we have to take money from international donors, but we actually have domestic funding if we reprioritized. So if we moved away from law enforcement, and if we moved to harm reduction, for example, these are some of the divest-invest issues that we're starting to talk about. And just before you all leave, just remember that on the website, actually there's a QR code that you can find outside. If you use that, it'll take you to an app which has all the conference information, which will also be updated on a regular basis, so ensure that you're checking there. If, like me, you have a type of phone that seems to not like the QR code, all the information is also available on the website. So also have a look there as information is updated. I just ask you to please remain seated as the president leaves, and we thank him incredibly. Unless you want to stay, can you stay? Is that all right? No. I'm being presumptive. And so, yes, so between me and drinks, you choose drinks. Please enjoy the conference and let us get as much as we can out of it. Thank you all for being here.